How's it going, comrades? Happy Black History Month. I probably sound like a broken record for starting my last several videos this way, but I want to apologize again for my sporadic uploading. I've been so tired. I oftentimes don't have the time. And when I do have the time, I'm just so burned out. I'm sure that many of you can relate in this capitalist hellscape. We're all just trying to get by, earn an honest living, but still we live paycheck to paycheck, and we're struggling out there. But still, going forward, I would like to be more consistent, uploading at least once a week. We have a lot of ground to cover, a lot of topics to go over, both historical and current. Something that's been on my mind these past few weeks, and something I want to touch on in this video today, is how slavery, in particular the slavery as practiced in the United States in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, how that has impacted and how that has evolved into the capitalism that we live under today. Think about it. Slavery transformed into sharecropping. Plantations have now become factories. Think about it. Oftentimes, back when I worked at Walmart, people would ask me what I do there, what my job title is. And oftentimes I would jokingly say that I pick cotton. Now, oftentimes that was just, an attempt at dark humor. Most people did find it funny and laughed. But there is a huge kernel of truth in there. And funnily enough, the people that did find it funny were African Americans, because they knew that there was truth in that. But oftentimes the only people that weren't as amused were the white people that I was talking to. Now, all the love to them, they didn't mean anything by it. But, they questioned the logic. And they were like, hey, we can appreciate that you are struggling out there, but it's not nearly as bad. Because you have a choice, right? You don't have to work for this job. You don't have to work for that job. You don't have to put up with it. Now, oftentimes economic libertarians, they get this so severely wrong, because they argue about how, capitalism is all about voluntary association, right? You don't have to work for any one employer. You can just go to another employer that treats you better. That logic would make sense if we lived in a meritocracy. The idea that those that work the hardest get ahead. That's not true at all. In fact, we oftentimes find the opposite to be true. We find that those that work the hardest have fallen the farthest behind. And those that just bark orders, those that lick the boots, and those that sell out, those are the ones that get ahead. Those are the ones that get the promotions. Those are the ones that get the raises. And how is it? It's been shown many times that CEOs, managers, top executives, and supervisors, they all share basic personality traits, psychological traits. So many of them are sociopaths or psychopaths. So many of them are narcissists. So many of them are control freaks. Does this sound like anyone we know in history? This sounds like the plantation owner. This sounds like the slave master. And oftentimes, they talk to you in the same way that they talk to you. They treat you in much the same way. They look down on you in much the same way. And ultimately, the core component of the slavery as practiced in the United States for several centuries, the core component of that is still present, and that is the commodification of human beings. The commodification of human beings. Ultimately, we're not people anymore with rights, with dignity, hopes, dreams, fears. a soul. We have become gears in a machine, a means to an end, easily expendable if we do not fall in line. They oftentimes tell us how we're replaceable. And they mean it. Because the second that you call out too often to take a mental health day, the second that you decide you're not going to put up with being spoken to just any type of way, the second that you decide to prioritize your well-being and stand up for your own self-respect, they will give you the boot. And they play favorites. Because who gets the promotions? Who gets the raises? Because oftentimes the hardest workers, those that do the job the best, they go nowhere. They're stuck in limbo. Even though this economic slavery obviously is not as visceral or as brutal, at least overtly and graphically, as the slavery practiced primarily in the American South, you can clearly see the threads. Back in the day when you were out of line, they would whip you, they would beat you, they would sexually assault you, have their way with you. Now, they write you up. They give you coachings. They have point systems. At Walmart, for instance, if I recall right, a no-call, no-show was 3 points, calling out was 1 point, and being late was half a point. And after 5 points, they fire you. You can clearly see how one thing led to another. Now, is this on the same level as the very real slavery that we still see in some parts of the world, where people are paid either nothing or mere cents? No, I am not trying to draw a false equivalence. But what I am saying, and what I do want to be forceful about, and not sugarcoat anything about, is actually talk about the history, and talk about how it influenced the present. What I'm trying to talk about, ladies and gentlemen, is wage slavery. My friends, there is no state, no city in the United States where you can afford an apartment working full-time on minimum wage. You just can't do it. And then even, you have the jobs that pay 16, 17, 18 an hour. Oftentimes, even that isn't enough because you factor in rent. You factor in groceries and gas. You factor in car payments and car insurance and phone bills and other miscellaneous things. Health insurance. Anything. They keep wages low so they can maximize profits. That is ultimately the business model of capitalism. The extraction of surplus value. Surplus value is what we create with our bare hands. We, the working people, we create this value. It is due to us. And ultimately, all I'm calling for, all that socialists and communists are calling for, is retaining the fruits of our labor and not having it stolen from us. That is another thing that modern day capitalism has in common with, the slavery practiced for several centuries here in this country. Think about it. Because how is it that CEO wages have skyrocketed by 1,000 or more percentage points, whereas earnings for everyday workers have remained more or less stagnant, a straight line, and have not grown with inflation, with productivity? And in turn, we have seen the gap between rich and poor expand. It's ultimately the haves and the have-nots. If we ever had a real middle class, my question is, Where is it? Does it still exist? Because there are some of us that, even those of us that are relatively well off, all it takes is missing a paycheck or two, having an emergency, a rainy day, whatever, a medical crisis, a car breaking down, and our world is destroyed in turn. And economic libertarians, they oftentimes like to pretend, hey, you have a choice, right? You don't have a choice when every single business in this country operates on this model. It's like telling a slave, hey, you have a choice because you don't have to work for this master. You can work for another master. That might treat you marginally better. It might not whip you as badly or as often. It might, give you better living conditions and working conditions. I'm sick of it. Ultimately, this conversation may be uncomfortable, but it is necessary. I will always speak truth to power. You say the quiet part out loud.